In the dusty heart of a forgotten desert town, Micah Dean wipes grease from calloused hands as another long day at his struggling auto shop draws to a close. A widowed father raising his quiet daughter June on love and determination alone, he's grown accustomed to making miracles from spare parts and stretching every dollar until it screams. Life moves in predictable rhythms until a sleek black SUV rolls to a stop outside his garage, steam rising from under its hood like morning mist. Out steps Sloane Whitaker, a woman whose designer clothes can't quite mask the exhaustion in her eyes. She's traveling with her 6-year-old son Elliot, a boy who hasn't spoken since tragedy stole his voice 2 years ago. What begins as a simple car repair becomes something neither adult expected, a collision of two wounded worlds that might just heal each other. But when a billionaire tech mogul asks a humble mechanic to become her silent son's father, can love really bridge the gap between two such different lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bell above the door chimed like a prayer as Sloane Whitaker stepped into the dim coolness of Dean's auto repair. The scent of motor oil and honest work hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile boardroom she knew so well. Her heels clicked against concrete stained with decades of good intentions and hard labor, each step echoing in the cavernous space where dreams were rebuilt one engine at a time. Micah looked up from the carburetor he'd been coaxing back to life, his weathered hands pausing mid-gesture. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that strength wasn't about what you could lift, but what you could bear. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, premature gifts from grief and responsibility, and his eyes held the kind of depth that comes from watching sunrises alone, wondering if the day would bring enough work to keep the lights on. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, setting down his wrench with the deliberate care of someone who respected his tools. "Sounds like your engine's got something to say." Sloane found herself studying his face, searching for the calculating glint she'd grown accustomed to in every interaction. Instead, she found only genuine concern, and the kind of patience that seemed to have been carved from the desert stones themselves. "It started overheating about 20 miles back," she said, her voice softer than it had been in months. "I'm hoping it's something simple." Behind her, pressed against the doorframe like a shadow seeking shelter, stood Elliot. 6 years old and carrying the weight of the world in his dark eyes, he clutched a worn backpack to his chest and watched the world with the wariness of someone who had learned too young that beautiful things could disappear without warning. His silence was absolute, not the comfortable quiet of a shy child, but the profound stillness of someone who had decided that words were too dangerous to trust. Micah's gaze shifted to the boy, and something in his expression gentled further. "Well, hello there, son," he said, his voice taking on the warm cadence he used with his own daughter. "You can come on in. There's a chair over by the window if you'd like to sit." From the back office came the sound of pencil on paper, steady and focused. June Dean, 11 years old and wise beyond her years, was bent over her homework at a desk that had seen better decades. Her long brown hair fell like a curtain around her face as she worked, occasionally pushing her glasses up, her nose with the back of her hand. She had her father's thoughtful nature and her mother's artistic soul, though she'd never known the woman who had given her life and left too soon. "June," Micah called softly, "we've got visitors." The girl looked up, her eyes immediately finding Elliot. Where adults might see a silent, possibly difficult child, June saw something else entirely. A kindred spirit who understood that the world could be overwhelming, that sometimes the safest place was inside your own mind. She sat down, her pencil, and approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded bird. "Hi," she said simply, extending her hand to show a small sketch she'd been working on. "I was drawing the sunset from last night. Do you like to draw?" Elliot's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his careful composure. He didn't speak, but he leaned forward just enough to see the paper where June had captured the desert sky in colored pencil, all oranges and purples, and the kind of hope that only comes at the end of a long day. Sloane watched this interaction with something, approaching wonder. In her world, children were scheduled, managed, enriched with activities designed to build resumes before they could spell their own names. But here was something different. Pure, uncomplicated kindness between two young souls who recognized each other across the space of their separate sorrows. "Your SUV's got a radiator leak," Micah said, drawing her attention back to practical matters. "Happened to a lot of vehicles this summer. The heat's been particularly brutal. I can fix it, but I'll need to order a part. Might take a day or two." Sloane felt something that might have been relief wash over her. 2 days. 2 days away from conference calls and quarterly projections and the endless pressure of being Sloane Whitaker, CEO of Whitaker Technologies, the woman who could make markets move with a single decision. 2 days to be just a mother with a broken down car in a town that time had gently forgotten. "There's a motel about a mile down the road," Micah continued, misreading her silence. "Clean rooms, decent air conditioning. Mrs. Rodriguez runs it. She'll take good care of you." "That sounds perfect," Sloane said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The afternoon stretched before them like a lazy cat, unhurried and warm. While Micah worked on diagnosing the full extent of the damage, Sloane found herself drawn to the shop's eclectic collection of rescued objects. Old license plates from a dozen states decorated one wall, each one telling a story of journeys taken and destinations reached. A coffee can full of bolts sat next to a photograph of a younger Micah with his arm around a woman whose smile could have powered the entire town. "That's my Sarah," he said quietly, noticing her gaze. "She passed 3 years ago. Cancer." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the weight that particular grief carries. Sloane understood that weight, not from personal loss, but from watching her son retreat into silence after his father's heart attack, the way trauma could steal voices and leave children clutching at shadows. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her. In her business world, condolences were often currency, traded for goodwill or strategic advantage. But standing in this garage, watching dust motes dance in the late afternoon light, she felt the simple human truth of shared sorrow. "She would have liked you," Micah said, returning to his work with the easy confidence of a man who knew his purpose. "She always said I was too serious, that I needed to remember there was a whole world outside this garage." June had settled into a corner with Elliot, showing him her collection of sketches. The boy still hadn't spoken, but he was nodding occasionally, even pointing to details that caught his attention. Their communication was happening in the spaces between words, in shared glances and gentle gestures that spoke to something deeper than mere conversation. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of apricot and gold, Sloane realized she couldn't remember the last time she had simply watched the day end without checking her phone, without calculating what the next morning would demand of her. The desert had a way of slowing time, of reminding you that not everything valuable could be measured in quarterly earnings or market share. "Mrs. Whitaker." June's voice was soft, tentative. "Would you and Elliot like to stay for dinner? Dad makes really good grilled cheese, and we could watch the stars come out afterward." Sloane looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in months, a flicker of interest, a subtle leaning toward possibility. He was still silent, still wrapped in his protective shell, but he was present in a way he hadn't been since before the world had taught him that fathers could disappear without warning. "We'd love to," she heard herself saying, the words tumbling out before caution could stop them. And so it began, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple offering of grilled cheese sandwiches and the promise of stars. In the fading light of that desert evening, four wounded souls found themselves drawn together by the mysterious alchemy of kindness, setting in motion a chain of events that would change them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The desert knew about patience, about the slow work of healing that happened in the spaces between words, and as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, it seemed to whisper that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with a destination in mind, but with the simple courage to stay for dinner. Morning arrived with the gentle insistence of desert light, filtering through the motel room's thin curtains and painting everything in shades of amber and possibility. Sloane had slept better than she had in months, lulled by the profound silence that only small towns knew how to keep. No traffic symphony, no urgent notifications buzzing through the night, just the whisper of wind across sand and the distant call of a morning dove greeting the dawn. Elliot sat cross-legged on his bed, carefully arranging the colored pencils June had given him the night before. His movements were precise, methodical, the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for building elaborate structures with his blocks. But there was something different this morning, a looseness in his shoulders, a softness around his eyes that spoke of sleep unmarked by nightmares. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sloane said softly, settling beside him. "How did you sleep?" He looked up at her with those dark eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young, and for a moment she thought he might actually speak. Instead, he held up one of the pencils, a deep blue the color of evening sky, and pointed toward the window where the morning light was beginning to chase away the shadows. The phone call came as they were getting dressed, Micah's voice apologetic and tinged with frustration. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm afraid I've got some bad news about your radiator. The part I ordered, well, seems there's been a shipping delay. Won't be here until Thursday at the earliest." Sloane found herself holding her breath, waiting for the familiar surge of impatience that usually accompanied any disruption to her carefully orchestrated schedule. Instead, she felt something that might have been relief settling in her chest, like a warm stone. "Thursday," she repeated, testing the word. "That's 3 more days." "I know it's an inconvenience," Micah continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that time was money, even if he'd never had much of either. "I've called every supplier within 200 miles, but with the heat wave, everyone's dealing with cooling system failures. If you need to fly out, I could arrange for your vehicle to be delivered once it's repaired." "No," she said quickly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "No, we'll wait. Elliot and I, we're not in any particular hurry." It was a lie, of course. Her assistant had been calling since yesterday evening, each message more urgent than the last. Board meetings were being rescheduled, conference calls pushed back, a delicate merger negotiation hanging in the balance while she sat in a desert motel room watching her son arrange colored pencils like prayers. But as she looked at Elliot, at the way he was holding that blue pencil like it contained some kind of magic, she realized that some things were more important than quarterly projections and shareholder expectations. Some things were worth protecting, worth creating space for, even if it meant disappointing people who had never learned to see beyond the next deadline. They found their way to the diner across from Micah's shop by mid-morning, drawn by the promise of coffee and the kind of simple human interaction that Sloane had almost forgotten existed. The place was a testament to endurance, all cracked vinyl booths and Formica countertops that had witnessed decades of small-town conversations and quiet revelations. "Well, look what the desert wind blew in," said Rosa Martinez, the woman behind the counter whose smile could have powered the entire establishment. She was somewhere in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent in service to others. "You must be the folks staying at the motel. Micah mentioned you might be with us for a few days." "Word travels fast in a small town," Sloane observed, but there was no edge to it, only gentle amusement. Honey, in a place this size. A new face. "It's front-page news," Rosa laughed, already pouring coffee without being asked. But don't you worry, we're not the prying type, just friendly. There's a difference, though I know city folks sometimes have trouble telling them apart. Elliot had claimed a booth by the window, his new pencils spread before him like an artist's palette. He was studying the view with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. The way the morning light caught the edges of the distant mountains, the patterns the shadows made across the empty street, the precise angle of a hawk's flight as it circled overhead. "He's got an artist's eye," Rosa observed, setting down a glass of orange juice without fanfare. "Reminds me of my grandson. Sees things the rest of us miss." Sloane watched her son through new eyes, wondering when she had stopped noticing the careful way he observed the world, the quiet intelligence that lived behind his silence. In her world of constant motion and endless demands, she had begun to see his muteness as a problem to be solved rather than a language to be understood. The diner's bell chimed as June entered, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a sketch, pad tucked under her arm. She spotted them immediately and made her way over with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Dad said you were staying longer," she said, sliding into the booth across from Elliot. "I brought some more drawing supplies, watercolors this time. I thought maybe we could try painting the desert." Elliot's response was immediate and unmistakable, a smile that started small and grew until it transformed his entire face. He reached for the watercolor set June offered, his fingers tracing the rows of pigmented squares like he was reading a braille. "You know," June continued conversationally, "I used to be really quiet too. After Mom died, I didn't talk to anyone except Dad for almost 6 months. Not because I couldn't, but because words felt too big, I guess. Like they might break something if I used them wrong." Sloane felt something twist in her chest, a recognition of the profound wisdom that could live in children who had been touched too early by loss. Here was this 11-year-old girl offering her silence as a gift, showing Elliot that his own quietness wasn't something to be fixed, but something to be honored. "What changed your mind about talking again?" Sloane asked softly. June considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "I guess I realized that the words weren't as dangerous as I thought, and that some people, like Dad, they know how to listen to the quiet parts too. Not everyone needs you to fill up all the empty spaces with noise." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Micah appeared in the diner's doorway, his work shirt already bearing the honest stains of the day's labor. He scanned the room until his eyes found their table, and Sloane felt something flutter in her chest at the way his expression softened when he saw them all together. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, approaching with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised to respect boundaries. "I wanted to apologize again about the delay, and Rosa makes the best apple pie this side of anywhere." "Please," Sloane said, moving over to make room. "And there's nothing to apologize for. These things happen." What she didn't say was that the delay felt less like an inconvenience and more like a gift. 3 unexpected days in a place where time moved at the speed of conversation rather than the frantic pace of profit margins. 3 days to watch her son discover that silence could be shared rather than endured alone. They spent the morning at the shop, Elliot fascinated by the careful choreography of mechanical repair while June worked on a new sketch. Sloane found herself drawn into the rhythm of the place, the way problems were approached with patience rather than panic, the way solutions emerged from understanding rather than force. When Elliot wandered over to examine a small wooden toy airplane that sat on Micah's workbench, a plane with one wing clearly broken and carefully glued back together, Sloane held her breath. The boy's father had been a pilot, had died when his small aircraft encountered unexpected weather. She waited for the familiar signs of distress, the retreat into protective silence that any reminder of flight usually triggered. Instead, Elliot picked up the plane with gentle hands, running his fingers along the mended wing as if he could feel the story of its breaking and healing. He looked up at Micah with a question in his eyes, and for a moment Sloane thought she might witness the miracle of her son's first words in 2 years. but Micah seemed to understand the unspoken question. "That belonged to a boy about your age," he said quietly. "Came in here with his grandfather last summer, crying because he'd dropped it and broken the wing. We fixed it together, took our time, made sure it was stronger than before. Sometimes the broken places, when they heal right, they're the strongest parts." Elliot nodded solemnly, cradling the plane like he understood exactly what Micah meant. And in that moment, Sloane saw something she had been searching for without realizing it. The possibility that healing didn't always require words, that sometimes it required only the presence of people who understood that broken things could learn to fly again. The day stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of possibility and the kind of gentle magic that happens when wounded. Hearts find themselves in the presence of unexpected kindness. And as Elliot carefully returned the plane to its place on the workbench, Sloane realized that some delays were actually destinations in disguise, carrying you exactly where you needed to be, even when you hadn't known you were lost. The second day brought with it a subtle shift, like the barely perceptible movement of tectonic plates beneath the surface of ordinary life. Sloane woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, a digital alarm clock counting down the moments until her carefully constructed world would demand her return. 17 missed calls, 43 unread messages, and a calendar that looked like a game of Tetris played by someone with anxiety disorder. She silenced the device with more force than necessary and turned to watch Elliot sleep in the amber morning light. He looked younger than his 6 years, his face peaceful in a way she hadn't seen since before David's death. His small hand was curled around one of June's colored pencils, as if even in sleep he was afraid it might disappear. The weight of her wedding ring felt heavier this morning. She still wore it, not on her finger where it would catch on keyboards and remind her hourly of what she'd lost, but on a thin gold chain around her neck, hidden beneath the armor of her business attire. David had slipped it onto her finger 8 years ago in a ceremony overlooking the Pacific, both of them young enough to believe that love could conquer anything, that death was something that happened to other people, in other stories. She touched the chain now through her shirt, feeling the familiar weight of promises that had become memories, of vows that ended with, "Till death do us part," without explaining how the living was supposed to continue afterward. At the garage, Micah was already deep in the meditation of mechanical work, his hands moving with the kind of certainty that comes from years of coaxing life back into broken things. He looked up as they approached, and Sloane noticed how his smile came easier. Today, how the lines around his eyes suggested laughter more than worry. "Morning," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some. June's already claimed the back office for her art project." Indeed, the sound of quiet industry emanated from the small room, where June had set up what could only be described as a creative command center. Watercolors, pencils, and sheets of paper covered every available surface, and in the center of it all, Elliot sat with the focused intensity of a master craftsman. "He's been working on something for the past hour," Micah said quietly. "Won't let anyone see it yet, but June seems to think it's something special." Sloane found herself moving closer to the office door, drawn by the sight of her son, engaged in something that clearly brought him joy. For 2 years, she had tried everything: therapy, art classes, music lessons, even a brief and disastrous attempt at horseback riding, searching for the key that would unlock his voice. But here, in this cluttered garage office with a girl who understood silence, he had found something that spoke to him in a language deeper than words. "Mrs. Whitaker?" June's voice was soft, respectful. "Elliot wanted to show you something, but he's a little nervous about it." The drawing was remarkable, not for its technical skill, though there was surprising sophistication in the way he had layered the watercolors, but for what it revealed about the inner landscape of a child who had been forced to grow up too. In quickly, He had painted the desert at sunset, but it wasn't the empty, harsh landscape that outsiders might see. Instead, it was alive with color and movement, with hidden life blooming in unexpected places. In the foreground, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a small figure sitting beneath a twisted Joshua tree. The figure was clearly a child, but what took Sloane's breath away was that the child was not alone. Beside him sat another figure, taller, protective, unmistakably adult, and in the careful way Elliot had painted their shadows, you could see that they were holding hands. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Sloane said, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't quite name. "Is that you under the tree?" Elliot nodded, then pointed to the adult figure. He looked up at his mother with those dark eyes that held too much. Understanding, and for a moment she thought he might speak. Instead, he picked up a pencil and carefully wrote something at the bottom of the paper. "For Dad," the words read in his careful 6-year-old script, "so he knows I'm not alone." The simple words hit Sloane like a physical blow. All this time, she had been so focused on trying to get Elliot to speak, to return to the chattering, curious boy he had been before tragedy taught him that the world was not a safe place. She had never considered that his silence might be less about the inability to communicate and more about the fear that speaking might somehow make his father's absence more real. But here, in this unexpected place with these unexpected people, he was beginning to understand that silence didn't have to mean solitude, that healing could happen without words, that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between speaking. "Elliot," she said softly, kneeling beside his chair, "would you like to tell me about your picture?" He looked at her for a long moment, then at June, who nodded encouragingly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rusty from disuse but clear as desert air. "The tree keeps the boy safe," he said, each word carefully chosen, "like Daddy used to do. But now the tree has a friend to help." Sloane felt tears she had been holding back for 2 years finally break free, not the controlled weeping of a woman who had learned to grieve in private, but the raw, honest tears of a mother who had just heard her child's voice after believing she might never hear it again. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him into a hug that smelled of watercolor paint and desert dust and the ineffable sweetness of childhood. "The tree has a very good friend." From the garage came the sound of Micah's work, methodical, patient, restorative. It occurred to Sloane that there were different kinds of repair, different ways of fixing what was broken. Her son was learning this lesson in real time, discovering that voices could be rebuilt just like engines, that trust could be restored, with the right combination of patience and understanding. But even as she celebrated this breakthrough, she felt the weight of her phone in her pocket, the pull of responsibilities that waited 2,000 miles away. Her assistant's latest message had been marked urgent in the subject line, followed by 3 red exclamation points that seemed to pulse with corporate anxiety. The merger negotiation, 6 months of careful planning, millions of dollars hanging in the balance, was threatening to unravel without her direct oversight. Her business partners were asking questions she couldn't answer from a desert garage, making decisions that could reshape the company she had built from nothing after David's death. She thought of her wedding ring, hidden beneath her shirt like a secret she wasn't ready to share. David had been the dreamer in their partnership, the one who believed technology could make the world better. After his death, she had thrown herself into building his vision, growing their small startup into a tech giant that employed thousands and influenced millions. It had become her memorial to him, her way of keeping his dreams alive. But standing here, watching her son discover his voice in the most unlikely of places, she wondered if she had been building the wrong kind of monument. David would have wanted her to be happy, would have wanted Elliot to laugh again, to trust again, to find joy in simple things like colored pencils and unexpected friendships. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Micah's voice interrupted her spiral of conflicted, Thoughts. I was wondering, would you and Elliot like to join June and me for dinner tonight? Nothing fancy, just barbecue in the backyard. June's been wanting to show Elliot her star charts. The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to name. Sloane could feel the careful distance they had both been maintaining beginning to shift, like sand dunes reshaping themselves in desert wind. "We'd love to," she heard herself saying, the words emerging from some part of her that remembered how to accept kindness without calculating the cost. And as Elliot carefully rolled up his painting to take with him, treating it with the reverence of someone who understood that he had created something important, Sloane realized that some gifts came disguised as delays, some healings happened in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the voice you thought you had lost was simply waiting for the right moment to sing again. Micah's backyard was a testament to a man who understood that beauty didn't require expense, only attention. String lights hung between two mesquite trees like captured fireflies, casting a warm glow over a space that had been carved from the desert with love and stubborn determination. A vegetable garden thrived against all odds in raised beds built from reclaimed wood, and a simple picnic table bore the honest scars of years spent hosting outdoor dinners and homework sessions under the stars. The wooden bird sat on the table's edge, still warm from the afternoon sun. Micah had carved it that morning while waiting for parts to arrive, his hands working automatically while his mind wrestled with thoughts he wasn't quite ready to examine. It was a simple thing, rough around the edges but somehow graceful. Its wings spread as if caught in the moment before flight. For Elliot, he had told himself, though the truth was more complicated. The truth was that he had needed something to do with his hands, while he processed the way Sloane's smile made the world seem brighter, the way her presence in his shop had awakened parts of himself he had thought died with Sarah. Dad. There. Here. June's voice carried across the yard as she spotted their guests approaching through the gap in the fence that separated Micah's property from the alley behind the garage. She had been preparing for this dinner with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for state occasions, arranging and rearranging the outdoor furniture, testing the string lights 3 times to make sure they worked properly. Elliot entered the backyard with the cautious wonder of someone stepping into a fairy tale. His eyes went immediately to the lights overhead, then to the garden, where tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, and finally to the wooden bird that seemed to be waiting specifically for him. "I made this for you," Micah said simply, offering the carving. To the boy, "Thought you might like something to remember our time here." Elliot accepted the gift with the reverence of someone who understood that handmade meant heart-made. He turned it over in his small hands, tracing the carved feathers with one finger, and when he looked up at Micah, his eyes were bright with something that might have been joy. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible but clear as sunrise. "It's beautiful." Sloane felt her breath catch. 2 words, 2 simple words that carried the weight of breakthrough, of trust offered and accepted. She watched Micah's face transform as he realized what he had just witnessed. Not just a child speaking, but a child choosing to speak to him, choosing to trust him with the precious gift of his voice. "You're very welcome," Micah replied, his own voice rough with emotion he was trying to contain. Birds like that, they're strong flyers. Even when they're resting, they're just getting ready for the next journey. The evening unfolded with the unhurried grace of desert time, each moment stretching like taffy in the warm air. Micah grilled hamburgers on a propane barbecue that had seen better years, but still did its job with reliable efficiency. June regaled them with stories of school friends and art projects, her chatter filling the comfortable spaces between adult conversation. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most. The way Elliot carefully placed his wooden bird next to his plate, as if it were standing guard over the meal. The way Sloane's shoulders gradually relaxed as the corporate tension she carried like armor began to melt away. The way Micah found himself studying her face in the string-light glow, memorizing the way laughter changed her features. June tells me you're quite the artist, Sloane said to Micah as they cleared the dinner dishes. She mentioned you carved all the decorations in her room. Micah felt heat rise in his cheeks. It's just a hobby, something to do with my hands when the day's work is done. Sarah used to say I thought too much, that I needed something to quiet my mind. May I see them? Sloane asked, the question carrying a weight that surprised them both. The carvings, I mean. The tour of June's room felt strangely intimate, more personal than any boardroom presentation Sloane had ever given. The space was small but carefully arranged, every surface displaying evidence of a father's love translated into wood and patient craftsmanship. A carousel horse stood on the dresser, its painted mane flowing like captured wind. Delicate butterflies seemed to dance along the windowsill, each one unique, each one perfect in its imperfection. Dad made all of these, June said proudly, picking up a small owl with eyes that seemed to hold infinite wisdom. This one's my favorite. Dad says owls can see in the dark, that they're not afraid of night. Elliot had gravitated toward a collection of small animals arranged on a low shelf. A rabbit mid-hop, a fox with its tail curled around its feet, a bear standing on its hind legs as if surveying its domain. He touched each one gently, and Sloane realized he was creating some kind of story in his mind, some narrative that connected these wooden creatures in a way that made sense to his 6-year-old understanding of the world. They're wonderful, Sloane said, and meant it in a way that went beyond polite appreciation. You have real talent. Sarah always said the same thing, Micah replied, his voice soft with memory. She wanted me to try selling them, maybe set up a booth at the county. Fair, but they were never made for selling. They were made for loving. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Sloane found herself thinking of her own work, of the company she had built in David's memory. Had she created something made for loving? Or had she built a monument to grief that looked like success from the outside, but felt hollow at its core? Later, as the children settled on a blanket in the yard, with June's star charts spread between them, the adults found themselves alone at the picnic table, the wooden bird standing sentinel between them like a witness to whatever was beginning to unfold. Tell me about your husband, Micah said quietly, the question emerging from genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. Sloane touched the chain around her neck, feeling the weight of her hidden ring. David was optimistic. He believed technology could solve any problem, that the right algorithm could make the world more fair, more just. He had this theory that if you could just connect people in the right ways, share information more efficiently, you could eliminate most of human suffering. And you? Do you believe that too? The question caught her off guard with its simplicity, its directness. In her world, beliefs were strategic positions, carefully calibrated to serve corporate interests. But sitting here under string lights in a desert backyard, she found herself considering what she actually believed rather than what it was profitable to believe. I used to, she said finally. Or maybe I wanted to believe it because David believed it so completely. After he died, building the company became my way of keeping his dream alive. But lately I wonder if we're just creating more sophisticated ways for people to avoid actually connecting with each other. From the blanket came the soft sound of Elliot's voice, barely audible, but unmistakably real, as he asked June about a particularly bright star. The conversation was halting, each word carefully chosen, but it was conversation nonetheless. The first real exchange he had initiated with anyone other than his mother in 2 years. Sounds like your son's beginning to find his voice again, Micah observed, following her gaze. Thanks to you, Sloane replied. To both of you. I've tried everything, specialists, therapy, art classes, music lessons. Nothing worked. But somehow, in 3 days here, he's begun speaking again. Maybe it wasn't about finding the right treatment, Micah suggested. Maybe it was about finding the right place to be heard. The insight hit her with unexpected force. She thought of all the experts she had consulted, all the strategies she had implemented, all the ways she had tried to fix her son's silence as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a language to be understood. But here, with this man, who carved beauty from discarded wood, and this girl who offered friendship without conditions, Elliot had found something more valuable than his voice. He had found the courage to use it. As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, as June packed up her star charts and Elliot carefully cradled his wooden bird, Sloane realized that she was facing a choice she hadn't expected to confront. Her phone had been buzzing steadily all evening, each notification a reminder of the corporate world that waited for her return. The merger negotiation, the board meetings, the carefully orchestrated life she had built as a monument to her husband's dreams. But watching Elliot say goodnight to June with actual words, watching him show Micah how the wooden bird fit perfectly in his small hands, she wondered if perhaps the best way to honor David's memory wasn't to build bigger monuments, but to create smaller moments of genuine connection, the kind her husband had actually believed in. The wooden bird seemed to watch her with carved eyes that held impossible wisdom. And as they walked back toward the motel under a canopy of desert stars, Sloane carried with her the unsettling realization that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in boardrooms, but in backyards, not with words, but with the simple sharing of handmade gifts that spoke directly to the heart. The third morning arrived with a photograph. Not the digital kind that lived in phones and disappeared into cloud storage, but the tangible sort that required intention. Film loaded into an old camera, light captured on silver halide, an image fixed in time and chemistry. Sloane had found the camera in her rental car's glove compartment, a relic from some previous traveler who had left behind this window into analog patience. She stood now on the small balcony outside her motel room, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of copper and gold, the old Nikon heavy in her hands. Through the viewfinder, the world looked different, more intentional, more worthy of preservation. Each frame required consideration, forced her to truly see rather than simply look. The image she captured was deceptively simple. The main street of the town in early morning light, empty except for Micah's figure in the distance, opening his garage for another day of honest work. But there was something in the composition, the way the light fell across the weathered storefronts, the sense of endurance and quiet dignity that permeated everything, that spoke to something deeper than mere documentation. This was peace, she realized. This was what it felt like to exist without the constant pressure of performance, without the weight of quarterly projections and shareholder expectations pressing down like gravity itself. For the first time in years, she had slept through the night without checking her phone, had woken without immediately calculating what the day would cost her. Down in the courtyard, Elliot sat at a small patio table with his wooden bird positioned carefully beside a glass of orange juice. He was talking to it, actual words, a steady stream of conversation that would have seemed remarkable if it weren't so beautifully ordinary. He was telling the bird about the stars June had shown him, about the way desert flowers bloomed only after rain, about the taste of grilled hamburgers and the sound string lights made when they swayed in evening breeze. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sloane said, settling into the chair across from him. "What are you and your friend discussing?" Elliot looked up with eyes that seemed clearer each day, less haunted by shadows that had followed him since David's death. "I'm telling him about this place," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word he chose to share. "So when we go home, he'll remember too." The casual mention of leaving hit Sloane with unexpected force. Home, the word carried weight she hadn't examined, implications she hadn't fully considered. Home was supposed to be the penthouse apartment overlooking the bay, the corporate headquarters where her name occupied the corner office, the carefully curated life she had built as proof that she had overcome tragedy and emerged triumphant. But sitting here in the desert morning light, watching her son speak to a hand-carved bird with more genuine affection than he had shown anything in 2 years. She wondered if perhaps home was less about geography and more about the people who saw you truly and loved you anyway. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Margaret, her assistant, whose loyalty had been tested beyond reasonable limits over the past 3 days. Sloane let it go to voicemail, then immediately felt guilty for the relief that flooded through her. "Mrs. Whitaker?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez from the motel office, a woman whose kindness seemed as natural as breathing. "There's a gentleman here asking about you. Says he's from your company." Through the office window, Sloane could see a familiar figure in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in the desert setting. Richard Chen, her chief operating officer and the closest thing she had to a friend in the corporate world, stood beside a black sedan that still radiated the chill of aggressive air conditioning. "Sloane!" His greeting carried relief and barely contained frustration in equal measure. "Thank God. When you stopped responding to calls, the board started to panic. The Yamamoto merger is falling apart, and there are rumors that Hartwell Industries is making a play for the municipal contracts we've been courting." The corporate language felt foreign after 3 days of simpler conversations, like a dialect she had once spoken fluently but now found awkward on her tongue. She found herself thinking of Micah's hands, patient and sure, as they coaxed broken engines back to life, and wondering when her own work had become more about acquisition than creation, more about defeating competitors than serving actual human needs. "Richard," she said carefully, "what if we let the Yamamoto deal fall through?" He stared at her as if she had suggested they burn down the headquarters. "Sloane, this is a $40 million acquisition, 6 months of negotiations. The board is expecting—" "I know what the board is expecting," she interrupted, her voice calmer than she felt. "But I'm asking you to consider what would happen if we didn't do this deal, if instead of growing bigger, we focused on growing better." Richard's gaze shifted to Elliot, who was now carefully arranging colored pencils in rainbow order while humming something that might have been a lullaby. "This is about the boy," he said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Sloane, I know these past 2 years have been difficult, but you can't make business decisions based on—" "On what?" she asked quietly. "On the fact that my son is speaking. Again, for the first time since his father died. On the fact that I've remembered what it feels like to wake up without anxiety. On the possibility that there might be more important things than market share and profit margins." The conversation that followed was difficult in the way that all truthful conversations tend to be. Richard laid out the financial implications of her absence, the domino effect of delayed decisions and postponed meetings. The Yamamoto acquisition wasn't just about money. It was about positioning, about securing the company's future in an increasingly competitive market. But as he spoke, Sloane found herself thinking about the photograph she had taken that morning, about the way morning light could transform something ordinary into something beautiful if you took the time to really see it. She thought about David's original vision for their company, about technology as a tool for human connection rather than corporate domination. "Give me until Friday," she said finally. "One more day. I'll fly back Saturday morning, and we can salvage whatever deals are salvageable." Richard's relief was palpable, but there was something else in his expression, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted in his friend and colleague, something that couldn't be fixed with emergency board meetings or crisis management. Strategies. As his sedan disappeared down the highway in a cloud of dust and determination, Sloane felt the weight of her 2 worlds pressing against each other like tectonic plates before an earthquake. In one direction lay the life she had built, the empire she had created as a monument to love and loss. In the other direction lay something unnamed but increasingly undeniable, the possibility that healing didn't always require building higher walls, but sometimes meant finding the courage to tear them down. That afternoon found her at Micah's garage again, drawn by the honest sounds of repair and restoration. He was working on an old pickup truck that had seen better decades, his movements economical and sure as he diagnosed problems that couldn't be solved with money, only with patience and understanding. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked without looking up, somehow sensing the weight she carried. "My business partner drove down from the city," she said, settling onto a crate that served as makeshift seating. "Apparently, my extended absence is causing what he diplomatically called strategic complications." Micah's hands paused in their work. "And what do you call it?" The question was simple, direct, and somehow impossible to answer with corporate speak or strategic deflection. What did she call it? This growing reluctance to return to a life that had once felt like purpose, but now felt like performance. This sense that she had been living someone else's dream for so long, she had forgotten how to dream her own dreams. "I call it the first time in 2 years that I've felt like myself," she said finally, "whatever that means." From the office came the sound of children's laughter. Elliot and June, working on some project that required frequent consultation and occasional eruptions of joy. It was a sound Sloane had almost forgotten, the music of childhood unburdened by adult anxieties and expectations. "You know," Micah said, returning to his work with renewed focus, "sometimes, when an engine's been running wrong for a long time, you have to strip it down to basics before you can fix what's really broken." The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. As Sloane watched him work, she found herself thinking about the photograph tucked in her camera, about the ways certain moments demanded to be preserved, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. And she began to wonder if perhaps the most important decision she would ever make wouldn't happen in a boardroom, but in a desert garage, surrounded by the honest smell of motor oil and the sound of her son's laughter echoing off concrete walls that had witnessed decades of small miracles disguised as ordinary repair work. The recipe card was yellowed with age and splattered with the evidence of countless Sunday afternoons spent in service to love. Sarah's handwriting danced across the index card in faded blue ink, measurements that relied more on intuition than precision, instructions that assumed the reader understood that a pinch meant different things depending on the season and the mood of the cook. "Apple pie was Sarah's specialty," Micah said, pulling the card from a wooden box that held the accumulated wisdom of a marriage cut too short. She never wrote down the real secret, though. Said it couldn't be measured, only felt. Sloane accepted the recipe with the reverence it deserved, understanding that she was being entrusted with something more valuable than mere cooking instructions. In her world, recipes were algorithms, precise, replicable, optimized for efficiency. But this faded card spoke of a different kind of knowledge, the sort that lived in hands that had learned to love through the daily ritual of nourishment. The kitchen in Micah's house was small but purposeful, every surface bearing the honest wear of a space that had hosted countless meals and conversations. Copper pots hung from hooks installed by someone who understood that good tools deserved proper care, and the windowsill herb garden spoke of cooking that began with growing, not purchasing. "June's at her friend Emma's house for the afternoon," Micah explained as he gathered ingredients. "Thought it might be nice to have some quiet time to really focus on the baking." Elliot had positioned himself at the kitchen table, his wooden bird standing guard over an ambitious drawing project that seemed to involve every colored pencil in June's collection. He was humming again, a soft, tuneless melody that suggested contentment rather than particular musical talent. The sound filled the kitchen with the kind of domestic harmony that Sloane had forgotten was possible. "First thing," Micah said, reading from Sarah's card, "is you've got to let the apples tell you what they want to be. Some are sweet enough to make you forget your troubles. Some are tart enough to wake up your whole mouth. The pie knows which ones it needs. Sloane found herself smiling at the anthropomorphic wisdom. And how exactly do you ask an apple what it wants to be? Like this, Micah said, offering her a slice of Granny Smith on the tip of a paring knife. Taste it, really taste it. Not just the flavor, but the story it's telling you about the tree it came from, the rain that fed it, the sun that sweetened it. The exercise felt absurd and profound in equal measure. In her corporate life, decisions were based on data analysis and market research, on focus groups and predictive algorithms. But standing in this kitchen, really tasting an apple slice, as if it mattered, she found herself accessing a different kind of intelligence, one that lived in senses she had trained herself to ignore. "This one's angry," she said, surprised by her own words. "No, not angry, determined, like it's been fighting for something." Micah's smile was warm with approval. "That's exactly right. The tartness comes from struggle, from trees that had to work harder for their sweetness. Those are the apples that give a pie its backbone." As they worked, peeling, slicing, measuring flour by feel rather than weight, Sloane found herself thinking about the photograph she had taken that morning, about the way certain images captured not just what something looked like, but what it felt like to be present in that moment. There was something similar happening here in this kitchen, a kind of alchemy that transformed simple ingredients into something that could carry love across time. "Sarah taught me this recipe the first year we were married," Micah said, his hands working automatically as memory guided his movements. "I was terrible at it, kept trying to follow the measurements exactly, getting frustrated when the dough didn't behave the way I expected. She finally took the measuring cups away from me and said, 'Micah, you can't love something into existence by controlling it. You have to trust it to become what it's meant to be.'" The wisdom in those words extended far beyond baking, and Sloane felt them settle into her chest like seeds that might bloom into understanding given enough time and attention. She thought about her relationship with Elliot over the past 2 years, about all the ways she had tried to control his healing, to manage his recovery like a project with measurable milestones and deliverable outcomes. "She sounds like she was very wise," Sloane said, rolling out pie crust with movements that were becoming more confident with each pass of the rolling pin. She was. Had this way of seeing straight through to the heart of things, you know. Never met a problem she couldn't solve with patience and a good meal. Micah paused in his apple slicing, his expression growing thoughtful. "I think she would have liked you. You've got that same quality. Seeing what people need even when they don't know how to ask for it." The compliment caught Sloane off guard, partly because it was so generous, and partly because it described someone she wasn't sure she recognized. The Sloane Whitaker who ran board meetings and negotiated acquisitions was known for her strategic thinking and decisive leadership, not for her intuitive understanding of human needs. But maybe that Sloane was only part of the story. Maybe the woman who had instinctively known that her son needed time and space to heal, who had chosen to stay in a desert town despite corporate pressure, who was learning to taste apples as if they had stories to tell. Maybe that woman had always been there waiting for permission to emerge. "Mum," Elliot's voice cut through her introspection, clear and strong, "look what I made." The drawing was extraordinary, not for its technical skill, though his artistic ability seemed to grow by the day, but for what it revealed about his expanding emotional world. He had drawn the 4 of them in Micah's backyard, but with the magical realism that children brought to their art. The string lights had become actual stars, close enough to touch, and the vegetables in the garden were growing in impossible colors. Purple tomatoes and blue corn and carrots that glowed like sunset. In the center of the picture, the 4 figures sat around the picnic table, but their faces were painted with expressions of such pure joy that Sloane felt her throat tighten with recognition. This was how her son saw their time here, not as a temporary delay or a pleasant distraction, but as something approaching magic, something worth preserving in the kind of art that came from the heart rather than the head. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, settling beside him to examine the details. Tell me about these stars. They're not just stars, Elliot explained, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone describing established fact. They're wishes that came true. June told me that if you make a wish on the right star, and if you really mean it, it can come down and live with you for a while. The simple explanation hit Sloane with unexpected force. Here was her son, who had spent 2 years afraid to speak, now casually discussing wishes coming true, as if such things were not only possible, but expected. And maybe they were. Maybe she had been so focused on managing outcomes and controlling variables that she had forgotten about the possibility of grace, about the way the universe sometimes provided exactly what you needed when you finally stopped trying to force what you wanted. As the afternoon wore on, as the pie filled the kitchen with the warm scent of cinnamon and promise, Sloane found herself thinking about the recipe card she held, not just Sarah's instructions for apple pie, but the larger recipe she was beginning to understand for a different kind of life. It involved ingredients she had forgotten how to value: patience, presence, the willingness to let things become what they were meant to be, rather than what you thought they should be. The timer chimed just as June returned from her friend's house, bursting through the kitchen door with the energy of someone who had important news to share. Mrs. Rodriguez said a fancy car came to the motel earlier, she announced. Someone looking for you. Was it important business stuff? Sloane met Micah's eyes across the kitchen, both of them understanding the weight carried by that simple question. Important business stuff. The phrase seemed to encompass everything that had defined her life before this week, everything that waited for her return to what people would call the real world. Yes, she said finally, but maybe not as important as I used to think. As they gathered around the table to share the first slices of apple pie, sweet and tart and perfect in its imperfection, Sloane realized that some recipes couldn't be written down, only lived, and that sometimes the most important ingredients were the ones you couldn't measure: trust, time, the willingness to let love rise at its own pace, like dough in a warm kitchen where patient hands had learned that the best things in life couldn't be rushed, only received with gratitude when they were ready to be shared. The documents arrived with Margaret's efficiency and corporate thoroughness, delivered by overnight courier to the motel desk in a manila envelope marked "Confidential, S. Whitaker, Eyes Only." Mrs. Rodriguez handed them over with the apologetic smile of someone who understood that important-looking papers rarely brought good news to people who were trying to escape from their regular lives. Sloane might have ignored them entirely, might have let them sit unopened while she spent one more precious day learning how to taste apples and watching her son discover the music in his own voice. But the return address made ignoring impossible. Hartwell Development Corporation, in embossed lettering that seemed to mock her temporary peace. She opened the envelope in the privacy of her room while Elliot napped, his wooden bird standing faithful guard on the nightstand beside him. What she found inside made her hands shake with a combination of fury and devastating understanding that felt like stepping off a cliff she hadn't known existed. The acquisition proposal was comprehensive, professional, and utterly ruthless in its scope. Hartwell Development Corporation, her company's primary competitor in municipal contracts, was planning to purchase 17 parcels of land in what they termed economically depressed desert communities for the purposes of comprehensive revitalization and modernization. The language was sanitized corporate speak for something much simpler and more brutal. They were going to buy up small desert towns, demolish them, and build sprawling retail complexes designed to serve the growing Phoenix metropolitan area. Page 3 of the proposal made her stomach drop. There, listed in neat columns with GPS coordinates and assessed property values, was every business on Main Street: Dean's Auto Repair, Rodriguez Family Motel, Martinez Family Restaurant, Rosa's Diner, the small market where June bought her art supplies, the post office where Mrs. Henderson had worked for 37 years, and at the bottom of the page, in smaller font that somehow made it more ominous, was the signature that made everything personal. S. Whitaker, CEO, Whitaker Technologies. Municipal Infrastructure Consulting. Her own signature, her own company. The technology firm she had built as a monument to David's dreams was providing the municipal consulting services that would make this destruction possible. They were mapping utility systems, analyzing traffic patterns, conducting feasibility, studies that would grease the wheels for Hartwell's development machine. The irony was so complete, it felt like cosmic punishment. She had come to this town as an accidental refugee, fleeing the corporate world just long enough to watch her son remember how to speak. And all the while, her own company was laying the groundwork for the destruction of the very place that had saved them both. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral of self-recrimination. Margaret stood in the hallway, her usually immaculate appearance slightly wilted by the desert heat and the urgency of her mission. "I tried calling," Margaret said, stepping into the room with the determined efficiency that made her invaluable in the corporate world. "The board is in emergency session. Richard's been fielding calls all morning from Hartwell's people, and there are questions about conflict of interest, about whether your extended absence has compromised the consulting contract." Sloane gestured to the document spread across the small motel table. "Did you know about this? About what our municipal consulting work was actually supporting?" Margaret's expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching discomfort. "The Hartwell contract is just infrastructure consulting. Standard municipal planning support. We provide technical analysis, traffic flow, utility capacity, zoning recommendations. We don't get involved in the actual development decisions." "Don't we?" Sloane asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "When we provide traffic studies that show Main Street can't handle increased commercial volume, when we analyze utility systems that conveniently need comprehensive upgrades that require tearing down existing buildings, when we create zoning, reports that classify family businesses as incompatible with modern commercial standards, aren't we making those development decisions by providing the justification for them?" The questions hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that extended far beyond this single contract. For 3 years, since David's death, Sloane had thrown herself into building the company, accepting contracts and pursuing growth without always examining what that growth served. She had told herself she was honoring her husband's vision of technology, making the world better. But now she wondered if she had been building something that served efficiency over humanity, profit over people. "The board wants you back in San Francisco by tomorrow," Margaret continued, her voice carefully neutral. "There's talk of removing you from active leadership if this absence continues. Some members are suggesting that grief has compromised your judgment, that you're not thinking clearly about the company's obligations." Sloane looked at Elliot, still sleeping peacefully with his carved bird nearby, and felt something crystallize in her chest. Not anger, but clarity so sharp it cut through years of accumulated assumptions about duty and success. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I haven't been thinking clearly, but not in the way they mean." That evening, she walked to Micah's garage with the documents folded in her jacket pocket, like evidence of a crime she hadn't known she was committing. The familiar sounds of mechanical work greeted her, the patient diagnosis of problems that could be solved with understanding rather than replacement, the careful coaxing of broken things back to wholeness. Micah looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, and something in her expression made him set down his tools immediately. "What's wrong?" She handed him the papers without explanation, watching his face as he read. She saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, when the abstract corporate language translated into the specific reality of his world being erased. His jaw tightened, but his voice when he spoke was steady, controlled. "So this is why you're really here," he said, setting the documents aside with deliberate care. "Scouting the territory before the bulldozers arrive." "No," Sloane said, the word coming out sharper than she intended. I had no idea. My company provides the technical consulting, but I didn't know what it was for. I thought we were helping. With infrastructure improvements, modernization projects that would help small communities grow. And now that you do know, the question was simple, direct, and impossible to answer without choosing sides in a conflict she had never wanted to be part of. On one side lay her company, her employees, the shareholders who depended on profitable contracts. On the other side lay this place that had given her son his voice back, these people who had shown her what authentic community looked like. Now I don't know anything anymore, she said honestly, except that I can't be part of destroying this place. From the office came the sound of children's voices, June helping Elliot with some project that required serious concentration and occasional bursts of laughter. It was the sound of innocence that didn't yet understand how easily beautiful things could be destroyed by people who reduced everything to cost-benefit analysis and development potential. There's something else, Sloane said, pulling out the final document she hadn't shown him. They want to fast-track the project, beginning demolition in 6 months, with construction starting by next spring. They're calling it the Desert Springs. Entertainment complex, outlet stores, chain restaurants, a multiplex theater, everything your town isn't. Micah was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the workbench where he had spent years fixing things that other people would have thrown away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had lost too much already. I keep thinking about what Sarah would say, he said quietly. She always believed that things happened for a reason, that people came into your life when you needed them most. I thought maybe you and Elliot were meant to be here, that this was the universe's way of giving us all a second chance at something we didn't know we were looking for. The pain in his voice was worse than anger would have been, worse than accusations or demands for explanation. It was the sound of trust breaking, of hope being revealed as foolishness. Micah, she said, reaching for words that might bridge the growing chasm between them. I swear to you, I didn't know, and I'm going to find a way to stop this. How? He asked, not unkindly but with the exhausted realism of someone who had learned that good intentions rarely translated into changed outcomes. You're one person fighting your own company and Hartwell Corporation and probably half the municipal government. Even if you wanted to help, and I believe you do, what could you actually do? It was a fair question, and Sloane didn't have a good answer. She thought about the board meeting waiting for her in San Francisco, about the contracts already signed and the development machinery already in motion. She thought about her fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, about the employees whose jobs depended on profitable projects like this one. But she also thought about Elliot's voice, finally freed from 2 years of silence in this place that might soon exist only in photographs and memory. She thought about June's drawings, about the careful way Micah carved beauty from discarded wood, about Rosa's kindness and Mrs. Rodriguez's gentle wisdom. I don't know, she admitted, but I have to try. As she walked back to the motel under a canopy of stars that seemed dimmer than they had the night before, Sloane carried with her the weight of choosing between 2 versions of herself. The successful CEO who honored contracts and maximized shareholder value, or the woman who had learned to taste apples as if they had stories to tell, who had discovered that some things were worth more than they could ever be sold for. The choice felt impossible, until she realized that it wasn't really a choice at all. Some decisions made themselves, written in the laughter of children who had found friendship across the space of shared silence, carved into wooden birds that taught broken things they could learn to fly again. The night passed in restless fragments, each hour marked by the weight of decisions that felt too large for one person to carry. Sloane found herself standing at the motel room window as dawn painted the desert in shades of possibility and regret, watching the town wake up to what might be one of its last ordinary mornings. Margaret had left that evening with barely concealed frustration, armed with a corporate directive that felt like an ultimatum: return to San Francisco immediately, or face removal from active leadership. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting for Monday morning, and Sloane's continued absence was being interpreted as either a nervous breakdown or a betrayal of fiduciary duty. Neither interpretation left much room for the complicated truth of what was actually happening. Elliot woke slowly, his small hand immediately reaching for the wooden bird that had become his constant companion. For a moment, watching him emerge from sleep with that gesture of trust and affection, Sloane felt the pure, uncomplicated certainty of maternal love. Whatever else happened, whatever corporate consequences she faced, her son was speaking again. He was healing. That had to count for something in the moral mathematics of the universe. "Mom," he said, his voice still thick with sleep but clear as morning light. "Are we really leaving today?" The question she had been dreading delivered. With the directness that children brought to matters, adults preferred to complicate with explanation and rationalization. She had avoided discussing their departure, hoping that some solution would present itself, that the corporate world would somehow accommodate her growing understanding of what actually mattered. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, settling on the edge of his bed. "There are some complicated grown-up things happening that I'm trying to figure out." Elliot considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "Can I write a letter?" he asked. "Like the ones June showed me in her books? The kind where you tell someone something important, even if it's hard to say out loud?" The request caught her off guard. "Of course. Who would you like to write to?" "June," he said simply. "And maybe Micah too. I want to tell them something before we have to go." An hour later, they sat at the small table in Rosa's diner. Elliot hunched over a piece of paper with the focused intensity of someone undertaking important work. His tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated, each letter carefully formed, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had recently rediscovered the power of language. Rosa appeared with coffee and orange juice, her usual morning warmth, tempered by the knowledge that goodbyes were hanging in the air like storm clouds on the horizon. "That looks like serious business," she observed, nodding toward Elliot's letter. "He's writing to his friends," Sloane explained, surprised by how much the word friends meant in this context. In their old life, Elliot's social interactions had been carefully orchestrated playdates with children whose parents moved in the same corporate circles. But June's friendship with her son was something entirely different, organic, uncomplicated, based on shared silences and genuine affection rather than social convenience. "First letter he's ever written," Elliot announced, proudly looking up from his work. "June taught me how to make the words look like what they mean." When he finally finished, he folded the paper with the ceremonial care of someone who understood that he had created something important. "Will you read it to make sure it says what I want it to say?" he asked, offering the letter to his mother. Sloane unfolded the paper, recognizing immediately that she was being entrusted with something precious. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each letter formed with the concentration of someone for whom writing was still an act of discovery rather than routine. "Dear June and Micah," she read aloud, her voice catching slightly on the formal salutation. "Thank you for teaching me that quiet can be good and that broken things can still fly. I used to think that not talking meant I was broken too, but you showed me that sometimes not talking is just another way of listening. June, I never had a sister before, but I think this is what it feels like. You make colors look like music, and you know how to be quiet in the good way. I want to keep drawing pictures so I can remember how you taught me to see things that are beautiful even when they're small. Micah, thank you for making me the bird. I talk to him every day, and he helps me remember that dads don't really go away. They just get harder to see sometimes. When I hold the bird, I can feel all the caring you put into making him, and it reminds me that there are different kinds of dads in the world. Some dads are the kind you're born with, and some dads are the kind you find when you need them most. I don't want to leave, but Mom says sometimes grown-ups have to do things that feel wrong because other grown-ups are counting on them. I don't understand all of it, but I understand that you made our family bigger just by being kind to us when we were lost. If we have to go away, I want you to know that I will never forget how it feels to have people who like you just for being you, not for being quiet or loud or any particular way. I will keep the bird forever, and I will remember that love can be carved from wood, and kindness can make broken voices sing again. Love, Elliot. P.S. Mom doesn't know I'm writing this part, but I think she loves it here too. I think she's scared that loving something new means forgetting something old. But June showed me you can love lots of things at the same time without any of them getting smaller. Sloane finished reading in a silence that felt like prayer, understanding that her 6-year-old son had somehow managed to articulate truths that she had been struggling to comprehend. He had seen through to the heart of her conflict, had identified the fear that kept her anchored to a life that no longer served anyone's highest good. "That's a beautiful letter, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to contain. "Are you sure you want to give it to them?" "Yes," Elliot said with the absolute certainty that children brought to matters of the heart. "Words are supposed to be shared, right? That's what makes them real." They found June and Micah at the garage. The morning already warm enough that the big doors were open to catch whatever breeze the desert chose to offer. June was reading in the office while Micah worked on what appeared to be the same carburetor he had been coaxing back to life when they first arrived. Though Sloane was beginning to understand that some repairs took as long as they took, that patience was as important a tool as any wrench or screwdriver. "We brought you something," Elliot announced, his voice clear and strong. "A letter, the first one I ever wrote." June accepted the folded paper with the seriousness it deserved, understanding immediately that she was being honored with something important. As she read, her eyes grew wide, and when she finished, she looked up at Elliot with an expression of such pure affection that Sloane felt her heart constrict with the beauty of it. "This is the most wonderful letter anyone has ever written to me," June said solemnly. "Can I keep it forever?" "That's what letters are for," Elliot replied with the wisdom of someone who had just discovered the power of written words. "To keep forever." Micah read his portion of the letter in silence, his weathered hands holding the paper with the same careful attention he brought to delicate mechanical work. When he finished, he looked at Elliot with eyes that held understanding and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. "This is a gift I'll treasure always." The moment stretched between them, weighted with the knowledge that gifts like this one, the first letter from a boy who had found his voice again, were also acts of goodbye, ways of making permanent something that felt too precious to leave. "To memory alone, there's something I need to tell you all," Sloane said, the words emerging from a place of clarity that felt both terrifying and liberating. "About why we really need to leave, and about what's going to happen to this town." As she explained about the development project, about her company's unwitting role in providing the justification for destruction, she watched their faces process information that transformed their understanding of who she was and why she had come to them. But what surprised her was the absence of anger, the way both Micah and June listened with the same patient attention they brought to all difficult truths. "So you're going to fight it?" June asked when Sloane finished, her voice carrying the absolute faith that children had in the ability of adults to fix things that were broken. "I'm going to try," Sloane said, "but I need you to understand that trying might not be enough, and that trying might cost me everything I've built since David died." "Not everything," Elliot said quietly, his small hand finding hers. "You can't lose the important things. Love and voices and wooden birds, those things stay with you no matter where you go." In that moment, Sloane realized that her 6-year-old son had become her teacher, that the boy who had spent 2 years afraid to Speak had somehow learned wisdom that eluded adults who spent their lives managing risk and calculating outcomes. Love and voices and wooden birds, the things that actually mattered, the things that no corporate restructuring could touch. As they prepared to leave for what might be the last time, June pressed something into Elliot's hands, a small sketch she had made of the four of them under the string lights, but with an addition that made Sloane's breath catch. She had drawn roots extending from each figure down into the desert sand, roots that intertwined beneath the surface, connecting them, all in ways that were invisible but unbreakable. "So you remember," June said simply. "Sometimes when people have to go away, the roots stay connected anyway." And as they walked back toward the motel to pack their belongings, Sloane carried with her the understanding that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible, that some loves were worth protecting even when protection required giving up everything you thought you wanted for everything you never knew you needed. The car keys felt heavier than they should have, weighted with the finality of decisions that couldn't be undone. Sloane sat in the driver's seat of her repaired SUV, engine running, air conditioning fighting the desert heat with mechanical determination. Everything was packed, loaded, ready for the journey back to a life that felt increasingly foreign with each passing moment. But her hands wouldn't turn the wheel toward the highway. Elliot sat in the back seat, his wooden bird carefully secured, in his lap, watching the town through tinted windows, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. "Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. "What if we just stayed?" The simple words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they voiced the impossible wish that had been growing in her chest since the moment she realized what her company's consulting work was actually supporting. What if they just stayed? What if she walked away from quarterly projections and board meetings and the carefully constructed empire she had built as a monument to grief? "It's not that simple, sweetheart," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if complexity was something she had imposed rather than something that actually existed. "There are people counting on me, employees who need their jobs, responsibilities I can't just abandon." Through the windshield, she could see Micah standing in the doorway of his garage, watching their car with an expression she couldn't quite read. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave or might have been goodbye, and the gesture broke something loose in her chest that she had been trying to keep carefully contained. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Richard, probably wondering where she was, probably preparing to deliver another urgent update about corporate crises that required her immediate attention. She let it go to voicemail, then immediately felt the familiar stab of guilt that came with avoiding responsibility. "Mrs. Whitaker." The voice belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez, who had appeared at the passenger window with the quiet concern of someone who understood that departures were rarely as simple as they appeared. "Forgive me for intruding, but you look like someone who's wrestling with angels." The phrase was so unexpected, so perfectly accurate, that Sloane found herself rolling down the window to invite further conversation. "I suppose I am," she admitted, "though I'm not sure which side I'm supposed to be rooting for." Mrs. Rodriguez's smile carried the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to see the same dramas play out in different costumes, the same essential human conflicts dressed up in whatever contemporary complications happened to be fashionable. "In my experience," she said gently, "when you're wrestling with angels, it's usually because they're trying to show you something you're not ready to see. And what if what they're showing you feels impossible? What if choosing what your heart wants means hurting people you care about?" The older woman considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," she said finally, "that sometimes the choice that feels impossible is the only one that leads to anything real, and that most of the time the people who really love you want you to choose what makes you whole, even if it's inconvenient for them in the short run." As if summoned by their conversation, Micah appeared at the driver's side window, his hands still bearing the honest stains of morning work. "Sloane," he said quietly, "before you go, there's something I need to say." She turned off the engine, understanding somehow that whatever came next required the kind of attention that couldn't be given through glass and metal barriers. Elliot had grown very still in the back seat, sensing the weight of adult conversation that might determine the shape of their future. "I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday," Micah continued, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been hope. "About your company's involvement in the development project, about the position you're in, and I realized something." He paused, looking out toward the desert horizon, as if gathering courage from the endless sky. "This isn't really about saving the town, is it? Not primarily. It's about figuring out who you want to be when all the corporate titles and shareholder expectations are stripped away. It's about whether you're going to keep living someone else's version of your life or finally start living your own." The insight was so accurate it felt like surgery, cutting straight through to truths she had been avoiding. "And what if I don't know who that person is?" she asked quietly. "What if I've been playing a role for so long that I've forgotten what's underneath it?" "Then maybe," Micah said, his voice soft with understanding, "you need to stay long enough to find out." The words hung in the desert air between them, carrying possibilities that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Stay, not visit, not vacation, not temporary escape from responsibility. Stay. Put down roots in a place that had shown her what authentic community looked like, in a place where her son had found his voice again. "Micah," she said, her own voice barely above a whisper. "What are you asking me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, as if he were carving them from the same patient wood that had become his medium for expressing the inexpressible. "I'm asking if you want to be a family," he said simply. "Not the kind that gets negotiated in boardrooms or managed like a merger, but the kind that grows from shared meals and quiet evenings and children who learn to trust that the people they love aren't going to disappear just because the world gets complicated." The proposal hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, offering passage to a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. Not just love, though there was that too, unspoken but unmistakable in the way he looked at her, but partnership, the chance to build something together that served life rather than profit. "I'm asking," he continued, "if you want to help me raise June the way you've been raising Elliot, with patience and attention and the understanding that children need to know they're the most important thing in the room. I'm asking if you want to fight this development project not as a corporate executive, but as someone whose home is worth protecting." From the back seat came Elliot's voice, clear and strong. "Mom, can we say yes?" The question from her son, delivered, with the absolute faith that sometimes the answer to impossible questions could simply be yes, broke through the last of her careful defenses. She thought about the board meeting waiting in San Francisco, about the shareholders who would view her departure as betrayal, about the employees whose jobs might be affected by her choice to put love ahead of profit margins. But she also thought about Elliot's laughter echoing off garage walls, about June's drawings that captured the way kindness could bloom in unexpected places, about the taste of apples that told stories if you knew how to listen. "Yes," she heard herself saying, the word emerging from some deep place that had been waiting years for permission to speak. "Yes, we want to be a family." The smile that transformed Micah's face was like sunrise after the longest night, and as he reached through the window to touch her hand, Sloane realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were recognitions. Moments when you finally acknowledged what had been true all along, but hadn't been brave enough to claim. But even as her heart expanded to accommodate this new understanding of what was possible, she knew that choosing love didn't eliminate complexity, only reframed it. There were still corporate consequences to face, still battles to fight, still ways to find a path between honoring her responsibilities and claiming her truth. The difference was that now she wouldn't be fighting alone. The moment crystallized around the simple image of two small hands joining together, Elliot's fingers finding June's as they stood beside the car, watching their parents navigate the complex geography of adult emotions. There was something profound in that gesture, something that spoke to truths deeper than corporate strategy or development projects or the careful calculations that governed most grown-up decisions. "Look," June whispered to Elliot, pointing not at their parents, but at their own joined hands. "We're already family. The grown-ups are just figuring out what we already know." The wisdom in her words hit Sloane with the force of revelation. Children understood instinctively what adults complicated with analysis and planning, that love wasn't something you negotiated, but something you recognized, that family wasn't a structure you built, but a reality you acknowledged when it appeared. "You're right," Sloane said, stepping out of the car to face this new configuration of possibility. "But now we have to figure out what comes next. How do we make this work in the real world?" It was Micah who provided the first piece of the answer, his voice carrying the steady confidence of someone who had spent years fixing things that seemed broken beyond repair. "We start with the development project," he said. "If we're going to build a life here, we need to make sure there's still a here to build it in." The next hours unfolded with the focused intensity of a military campaign, but one fought with laptops and legal documents rather than weapons. Sloane spread the Hartwell development proposals across Micah's kitchen table, studying them with the analytical skills that had made her successful in the corporate world, but now applied to protecting rather than acquiring. "The weakness is in the timeline," she said, pointing to a section of the contract. "They need municipal approval by the end of the month, and they're depending on our consulting reports to justify the zoning changes. But what if those reports contain different conclusions?" Micah looked up from where he was making coffee, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "You're talking about changing your own company's recommendations." "I'm talking about providing accurate recommendations instead of convenient ones," Sloane corrected. "The traffic studies, the utility assessments, the economic impact analysis, they're all based on assumptions that favor development over preservation. But what if we presented alternatives? What if we showed that this community has economic value exactly as it is?" The plan that emerged over the following hours was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of fighting the development project through litigation or political pressure, approaches that would likely fail against Hartwell's resources, they would undermine it with better data, more creative solutions, and the kind of community organizing that happened when people fought for something they loved rather than against something they feared. Sloane's phone had been buzzing steadily with increasingly urgent calls from San Francisco, but she had reached a decision point that felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. When Richard's name appeared on the screen for the 10th time, she finally answered. "Sloane, thank God." His voice carried relief and barely contained frustration in equal measure. "The board is in complete chaos. There are rumors you've had some kind of breakdown, and Hartwell is threatening to pull out of the consulting contract. If you don't return immediately." "Richard," she said calmly, watching through the kitchen window as Elliot and June worked together on some elaborate art project in the backyard, "I need you to listen very carefully. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough, and I need you to help me restructure the Hartwell consulting contract." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Restructure how?" Richard finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I want to expand the scope to include preservation alternatives and community development options. Instead of just providing data that supports demolition, we're going to present a comprehensive analysis that includes renovation, adaptive reuse, and sustainable tourism development." Sloane, that's not what they're paying us for. They want justification for their plans, not alternatives to them. Then maybe it's time we stop taking contracts that require us to ignore better solutions just because they're not what the client wants to hear. The conversation that followed was difficult in the way that all truthful conversations tend to be. Richard laid out the financial implications, the potential legal challenges, the risk to employee jobs and shareholder value. He wasn't wrong about any of it. Choosing principle over profit always carried costs that extended beyond the person making the choice. But as Sloane explained her decision, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Alignment between her actions and her values, between the work she was doing and the legacy she wanted to leave for her son. "I'm not asking you to agree with this immediately," she told Richard. "I'm asking you to trust me enough to explore whether there might be a way to do well by doing good, to build a company that David would actually recognize." By evening, the kitchen table had been transformed into mission control for what June had dubbed Operation Save Everything Important. Legal documents mixed with children's drawings, financial projections, shared space with Elliot's collection of colored pencils, and somewhere in that beautiful chaos, a plan was taking shape. Mrs. Rodriguez had appeared with a casserole and stayed, to provide the kind of practical wisdom that only came from decades of watching communities survive against impossible odds. Rosa had brought coffee, and the promise that every business owner on Main Street would participate in whatever fight was coming. "The thing about small towns," Rosa explained, settling into a chair that creaked with comfortable familiarity, "is that we know how to pull together when it matters. We've survived droughts and recessions, and every kind of hardship you can imagine. Developers with big plans and bigger checkbooks. We've seen them before." As the evening wore on, as plans solidified into action items and phone calls were made, to lawyers and community leaders and sympathetic journalists, Sloane felt herself becoming part of something larger than her individual choice to stay or go. She was joining a web of relationships that had been decades in the making, accepting a role in a story that extended far beyond her personal journey from grief to healing. The moment that crystallized everything came near midnight when she found Elliot and June asleep on the living room floor, their hands still joined even in sleep, surrounded by the evidence of their collaborative art project. A massive mural that showed the town as they saw it, not as a collection of buildings to be demolished, but as a living ecosystem of relationships and dreams, and the kind of everyday magic that happened when people chose to care for each other. "They understand something we adults forget," Micah said quietly, appearing beside her with 2 cups of tea. "That love isn't complicated. It's only the logistics of love that get complicated." "And are you ready for complicated logistics?" Sloane asked, accepting the tea and the implicit promise it carried, that they would face whatever challenges came next together, as a family bound not by legal documents, but by the simple choice to show up for each other. "I've been ready my whole life," Micah replied, his hand finding hers with the same natural ease that had joined their children's fingers. "I just didn't know what I was getting ready for until now." Outside, the desert night wrapped around them, like a blessing, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate with a voice that spoke of patience and persistence and the kind of love that could carve beauty from the hardest materials, given enough time and attention and the willingness to believe that broken things could learn to sing again. 6 months later, the photograph sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece above the fireplace that Micah had built in the house they now shared. A sprawling adobe structure that had grown organically over the decades, each edition reflecting the changing needs of the families who had called it home. The image captured all 4 of them on the day the preservation project had been officially approved, their faces bright with the particular joy that comes from fighting for something you love and discovering that sometimes, against all odds, love actually wins. But it wasn't the only photograph on that mantel. Beside it sat the old wedding pictures, Sloane and David on their clifftop ceremony, Micah and Sarah in the courthouse where they had exchanged vows with June as their witness. These images weren't relegated to boxes or hidden away like painful reminders of abandoned chapters. Instead, they occupied places of honor, integrated into the visual story of a family that understood that love didn't diminish when it expanded, that new beginnings didn't require forgetting what came before. Elliot's voice drifted from the kitchen where he was helping June prepare lunch for the construction crew that was working on the town's new community center, the centerpiece of the preservation and revitalization plan that had ultimately saved Main Street from Hartwell's bulldozers. His chatter was constant now, a delighted stream of observations and questions, and the kind of verbal exploration that made up for 2 years of silence. "June, do you think the painted butterflies taste different from the regular ones?" he was asking, his 6-year-old logic wrestling with the philosophical implications of his sister's latest art project. "Only one way to find out," June replied, with the patience of someone who had learned that the best answers often came through experimentation rather than explanation. Sloane smiled as she folded laundry in what had become their shared bedroom, marveling at how domestic harmony could feel both miraculous and completely natural. The transition hadn't been without its challenges, combining 2 households, 2 parenting styles, 2 sets of grief and hope, and carefully guarded vulnerabilities. But somehow, in the mysterious alchemy of chosen family, they had created something that worked. The professional consequences of her choice had been exactly as complicated as Richard had predicted. Leaving Whitaker Technologies had required months of legal negotiations, shareholder meetings, and the kind of corporate restructuring that made headlines in business journals. But the company had survived her departure, eventually thriving under Richard's leadership and a new commitment to ethical consulting that prioritized community benefit alongside profit. The Hartwell project had ultimately been defeated not through litigation, but through better ideas. A comprehensive preservation and development plan that showed how small towns could grow without losing their souls, how economic development could serve existing communities rather than displacing them. Other towns had begun implementing similar approaches, and Sloane found herself building a new kind of consulting practice, one that helped communities preserve what was valuable while adapting to changing needs. "Mom!" Elliot's voice carried from the kitchen with the urgency of someone who had made an important discovery. "The butterflies don't taste different, but they make the cookies look like they're trying to fly away." It was exactly the kind of observation that would have worried her in their old life, the kind of imaginative thinking that didn't translate well to standardized tests or college preparation programs. But here, in this context, it was simply evidence of a mind that was learning to play again, to find wonder in small things, to trust that the world was fundamentally safe enough for creative thinking. Micah appeared in the doorway, his work clothes dusty from the morning spent installing solar panels on the community center roof. The project had become a model for sustainable development, attracting attention from urban planners and environmental groups who wanted to understand how small communities could balance preservation with progress. "How are the butterflies?" he asked, kissing the top of her head with the casual affection of someone who had learned that love was best expressed in small, repeated gestures rather than grand declarations. "Apparently ready for takeoff," Sloane replied, leaning into the warmth of his presence. "And the solar installation, ahead of schedule and under budget. Turns out when people are working on something they believe in, efficiency just happens naturally." It was a lesson she had learned repeatedly over the past 6 months, that the most sustainable solutions usually emerge from communities that felt ownership over their own futures, that the best development projects were the ones that grew from local wisdom rather than external expertise. That afternoon brought visitors, a delegation from a mountain town in Colorado that was facing its own development pressures and wanted to learn from what had happened here. As Sloane walked them through the preservation plan, explaining how they had managed to balance historic preservation with economic growth, she felt the deep satisfaction of work that aligned with her values. But the real measure of success wasn't in the accolades or the consulting fees or even the saved buildings. It was in the sound of children's laughter echoing from the playground that had been built where a parking lot was once planned, in the sight of Rosa's Diner with its historic landmark plaque and its line of customers that now included tourists alongside locals, in the knowledge that Elliot and June would grow up in a place that valued what they had to offer, rather than demanding they conform to someone else's vision of success. As evening approached, the family gathered in the backyard, where string lights still hung between the mesquite trees, though they had been joined by a vegetable garden that was June's project and a workshop where Micah had been teaching Elliot the basics of woodworking. The wooden bird still held a place of honor on Elliot's nightstand, but it had been joined by other carvings, a family of creatures that had emerged from their collaboration, each one unique but clearly part of the same loving tradition. "You know what I was thinking?" June said, as they sat around the picnic table sharing the day's final meal. "We should write a letter to our future selves, like the one Elliot wrote to us, but this time telling ourselves how it feels right now so we never forget." It was the kind of idea that could only come from someone who understood that the present moment was worth preserving, that happiness was something to be documented rather than simply experienced and released. "What would you want to tell your future self?" Sloane asked, genuinely curious about what wisdom an 11-year-old might want to preserve. June considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "I'd want to remember that families can be made from scratch, that love is something you do rather than something that happens to you, and that the best adventures are the ones where everybody gets to come home together at the end." As the stars appeared overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations, their growing trust, their choice to build something new from the pieces of their separate sorrows, Sloane realized that some stories didn't end so much as transform into new beginnings. The photograph on the mantel would fade eventually, the way all photographs did. But the love it captured had put down roots that extended far deeper than images or memory, roots that would nourish whatever grew from this ground they had chosen to tend together. And in the desert night, surrounded by the sound of voices that had learned to harmonize across the space of shared silence, Sloane understood that the best monuments weren't built from steel and stone, but from the patient accumulation of ordinary moments made sacred by attention, made permanent by the simple choice to show up for each other day after day in all the beautiful complexity of chosen love.